Well, we're going to carry on talking about some of the same subjects, but from a slightly different perspective, a perspective a bit closer to within Cuba and close to Cuba, to talk about economic and monetary reform and where it's got to and where it might go to. And we have a great panel to do that. First of all, Ricardo Torres, who is a professor at the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy in Havana. Ricardo. In Brazil, they say Deus é brasileiro. God is Brazilian, but in fact, Deus é cubana. It's Marta Deus, who has her financial services boutique, consulting with cuentapropistas, with small businesses. And then we have Dave Seleski from Stonegate Bank, based in Pompano Beach in Florida. And you may have heard of Stonegate Bank because they came to the rescue last year, providing banking services for the Cuban embassy. So thank you all. So Ricardo, let's start with you. The guidelines for economic reform were announced in 2010, or finalized in 2010. The period to implement them is up till the next party congress. A lot has been done. I think Raul Castro has said that something like 70 to 75% have been implemented. Now, that's a kind of that's a quantitative rather than qualitative number, perhaps. And there are two big things that that have not yet been fully done, right, or at all. One is state enterprise reform, and the other is monetary reform. As the previous panelists mentioned, I mean, you have the two currency. You have both a two currency system and a multiple exchange rate system. It's extremely complicated, not least because the two currency system is a way of distributing subsidies and incentives in the economy. So unraveling that is a nightmare, frankly. What's your take on where the process has got to and the big pending issues?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to speak to you today. So I would like to start by making a reference to change in Cuba over the last, let's say, 7 years or 6 years on two fronts. So let us all remember that Cuba suffered a huge financial crash between 2009 and 2010. So I think like a big deal. So that was a big deal for the government. So a lot of energy and some time has been devoted to restore the country's ability to honor its international obligations. So I think Cuba has been quite successful at restructuring a large part of its foreign debt, and by doing that, creating conditions for the country to, to insert into the, world financial system. Then the other part is the one that, in my opinion, is more strategic, so that is more linked, I would say, to the lineamientos, to the guideline. So we've seen important changes in the ownership structure in the economy. So the room for the private sector, for the non-state sector in general, self-employed, as they are called in Cuba, and cooperatives has been expanded significantly by Cuban standards over the last 5 years. That has created lots of opportunities for many people, and everyone that's been in Cuba in these days, can see that. So the government also passed a new foreign investment law in 2014, launched the Mariel Initiative in late 2013 as part of we hope, a new policy towards foreign investment, because the law is important, but more important is how we use the law, how we implement the law. So we are seeing now that some change in the government's opinion on the role of foreign investors in the country. Some may say that the process has been quite slow, but I would say that there's been progress, and we really, look forward to accelerating a little bit the process of, bringing more foreign capital to the country. There's been also timid, I would say, changes in state companies. But frankly speaking, there are lots of doubts right now around that in Cuba. How it's going, and the outcomes so far not very encouraging, I would say. And also the government announced that in 2013 as well that they had a plan to gradually phase out the current monetary and exchange rate system. So far, very little progress in that area. It's been already 2 years. It's a highly complex issue with important implications. It's technically challenging, and also it has potentially big implications for the society as well at large. The way we tend to think about that, some of us, is that the cost of inaction is higher than keeping the system, than phasing out the system.
Yeah, that's the economic cost is higher, but the political cost of action is probably higher in the short term than the political cost of inaction, right? And I mean, if on monetary reform, there was talk a couple of years ago of a Dia Cero, of a D-Day, when there would be a big changeover. I was in Havana, in Cuba, in 2013, and I asked Marino Murillo, the minister in charge of economic reform, about this, and he said monetary reform is complicated for us as well. I mean, getting your head around it is very difficult. But it's, I mean, when I was there earlier this year, and we talked about this in Havana, it looks as if what they're moving towards now is a situation where you would abolish the CUC, the hard peso, the one-to-one peso to the dollar, or one-to-one thereabouts, and just keep the multiple exchange rates and gradually try and merge them. Is that your understanding, or what do you think is going to happen?
Well, in terms of monetary and financial issues, it's always complicated to make forecasts. I would say that what I can say on what I understand of the process is that although we have two different processes. One is currency unification, and the other one is bridging the gap between the several exchange rates that are now operating in Cuba. Of course, those are related, one to the other, but those are different processes.
Exactly.
So I could imagine that we'll start by phasing out or getting rid of one of the currencies, and then eventually, gradually, bridging the gap, bringing together the several exchange rates.
And you referred to the economic cost of inaction. I mean, as the previous, one of the speakers on the previous panel said, there's an anti-export bias in the current system. There's also an anti-import substitution bias, right? And then you have a series of subsidies distributed through the currency system. I mean, how long can Cuba go on without changing this arrangement?
Well, that's hard to say. It's been there for 20 years already, incredibly enough. We know that it's very costly. It's not only that there is an anti-export bias in the system, it's also that it distorts resource allocation. It's hard for any Cuban entity to know what the actual production cost is. So it distorts price setting as well. So it distorts everything, economic measurement. Well, there are figures about Cuba's GDP. We don't actually know what's the actual size of our economy. If we don't know that, we don't know basically anything about our economy. So it's then take that at the firm level. Some firms pay some inputs in CUC, some others in CUPs. Well, the labor costs in general are in CUPs. So then for them they use a one-to-one, but we know that's not the market exchange rate. So it's difficult to know what the actual production cost is. If a firm, again, at the firm level, doesn't know what the actual production cost is, doesn't know anything
Yeah,
about their business. So
Sure.
it is a big problem, I would say. We could stay in this mess for another 20 years, but the cost is huge. The problem is, I mean, you said that the political cost of doing something right now, short term, is big. I may agree with that. But the problem with these kind of things is that that political cost is very visible. Whereas the one I'm talking about is invisible.
Yeah.
Because it's everywhere. But it doesn't mean that it's not there, and it doesn't mean that it's not big. It's enormous.
Yeah.
And we are all paying for that every single day in every single decision we make about consumption, investment, all that. I mean, we consumers and we firms.
Yeah. Very interesting. Marta, from the perspective of the people you work with, of the cuentapropistas, of the small, self-employed and small businesses, what do these issues look like? And what would you like to see? What's the most important thing to change for the self-employed non-state sector to flourish?
Yeah, it's difficult for them, the double currency, because they have to pay the taxes in pesos, and the incomes are in CUC. Most of the incomes are in CUC. So, to have the two currencies are difficult, no, for them and for us, because we do the accounting for them. But it's not very, it's not very hard for the people. They are used to how to manage with two currencies. I think the thing they would like to change or they would like to improve is the banking, because the entrepreneurs and the small business, they would like to have a close relation with banks.
I mean, how many of these people have bank accounts in Cuba?
They don't have much. Yeah. They use cash all the time, yes.
And that's because when they go to the bank's not interested, or because they don't go to the bank?
No, it's difficult to go to the bank. They don't know what they have to do with the small business. They know they can open bank accounts, but for example, we don't have online transactions. Yeah. We can use it. It's like, for example, if you want to make a transfer, you have to go to the bank. You can't do it online. If you want to receive money from a company, you have to have an authorization from the director. It's very hard, the relation with the bank for the entrepreneurs or the small businesses. Also the bank, sometimes they don't know what they can do and what they can't, because all is new, for them, the cooperatives and the cuentapropistas. Everything is new for them, and sometimes nobody have told them what they can do for the entrepreneurs.
No,
so
sure. I mean, when I go to Cuba, I look at the non-state sector. Sometimes I think what Cuba has done is actually just legalize the informal economy, and it looks very like. A large part of it looks like the informal economy in the rest of Latin America. Yeah. And I wonder to what extent people are scared of, if you go to the bank, you have to declare your accounts, and maybe you don't want to do that. I don't know.
Yeah, it would be better if and more formal for them if they could have all the money they they receive in their account and all the payments and pay the light and everything with their bank accounts. But now you can't. Everything is in cash. Also for the taxes, we have to go with a big amount of cash and go to the bank and then pay the taxes for them. So I think it's very important for small businesses, what I know, cooperatives and cuenta propista, best relation with the bank, because they need it and they want to be legal. They don't want to have cash.
Sure.
They want to, I think the people in Cuba they don't want to. They want to legalize their business. They want to pay taxes. Because it's if you're illegal, if you're doing things illegal, it's like you remember bad times. No,
It's a big worry.
The new time is to be illegal, to have. And that happened to me a lot in my business because everybody comes, young people come and they want to do, business in like publicity or designers, and they always tell me how I can pay taxes, how I want to have my license. And it's funny because I lived in Spain for 13 years, and then everybody wants to know how they can't pay taxes. In Cuba, everybody wants to pay taxes. Right. So it's funny, but it's true. The people want to, to be legal, to have their business, and for that, the bank and the, one currency, all that things could help to feel confidence in the people and to think that things are changing and,
Sure. Just before I go to Dave, another big problem for the non-state sector is the state monopoly of wholesale markets and of foreign trade, of import and export. Do you see that changing anytime soon, or do you think that'll have to wait till after the Party Congress and perhaps a lot longer?
Well, I saw in the Cartera de Oportunidades, is a group of, Cartera de Oportunidades, how do you call it? Investment portfolio. The Cuba want to, companies who open
the foreign investment portfolio that Jessica was referring
for
to.
Wholesale,
sure.
yes. And I think I don't know, but because that should happen before, now we have like 3-4 years of cuenta propistas and cooperatives, and we don't have wholesale shops, and they have to they buy the things in the same place where other people buy, and it's very difficult. They go to the markets, and they have to put one person to buy the things. It's only for this, and it's really very difficult for them to get the things they need to have a good quality or good in their business. But it's difficult to understand how they haven't opened yet a wholesale market for them, because they will have a lot of clients that will be full. So I don't understand, but it seems like they want to open, because I saw in the investment portfolio they want people who invest in this. And
that's interesting. Yeah. Dave, we heard this morning that you can't set up a business in Cuba yet, but you've been there several times. The Cuban government is now a client of yours. How do you see these issues of monetary and financial reform in Cuba?
Well, one comment just to add to the unification of the currency. There really is a third currency in Cuba, and that's the U.S. dollar. And I think the longer the Cuban government waits to unify the two currencies into one, there's a more of a flight to U.S. dollars by Cubans because there's the uncertainty and they're worried about potentially a devaluation type scenario. I don't think that's likely, but they definitely are worried about it. And then you get back to the whole economic issue. You know, if people are hoarding U.S. dollars, you got the whole issue of money circulating, the velocity of money. So I think it's negatively impacting these economic reforms and just the velocity of money and having it move through the system. And I've just seen over the last few years that this seems more and more people, the common people in Cuba, when they get an opportunity to exchange CUCs or pesos into dollars, they take the dollars and they don't bring it to the bank, but they put it under their mattress, so to speak. So that's a big issue. But regardless of currency reform, I mean, Cuba, until the embargo goes away or until there's a change in their use and the ability to use the US dollars internationally, is always going to have their arm tied behind their back. Simply for a couple different reasons. One is obviously it makes more sense for the US to trade with Cuba. I mean, you know, first place, there's a huge cultural affinity between the US and Cuba. Cuba identifies more, as dysfunctional as the political relationship is, Cuba identifies more culturally with the US than it does with Mexico, Brazil, Spain. Cubans want American goods. You know, there's the split families. Obviously, you've got a huge Cuban population in the US, Cuban-American population. And the ability for American companies to compete this sounds like Cuban rhetoric, Cuban government rhetoric, but the truth is, I see it daily as, you know, people try to make transfers and as companies open accounts with us, is that we're at a huge competitive disadvantage. Because A, you got to go through a currency conversion. If you're dealing with Cuba, you switch to euros and making transfers of money. It's difficult to get money back and forth. You know, you constantly, besides the embargo and all the compliance risks and all the other things you got to go for, the consultants you've got to hire and everything. But the use of the dollar is really pretty critical, I think, and overall in bringing cheaper goods into the Cuban economy and allowing our two countries from a business perspective to work together. The other thing is, you know, I'm a banker, so I think banks are the center of the universe and we make the economy go. But, you know, Cuba's been hamstrung due to the sanctions that can be put on banks doing business in Cuba. I mean, isn't it a little odd? I'm a $2.3 billion bank, and yet I'm the only bank that's really doing anything in Cuba in the United States. You know, the sanctions imposed due to Helms-Burton, the embargo, and so on, are very punitive. And it's not just U.S. banks, but it's other banks. You know, BNP Paribas took a, $8, $9 billion, I can't remember the exact number, a couple of years ago, fine for doing business in Iran, and then tangentially, I think, with Cuba. You know, so you could transfer $50,000 to Cuba and get a $1 million fine. Well, you know, a wire transfer fee is $55. I don't think from an economic perspective for Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Citibank that makes a lot of sense. But the use of the dollar, these sanctions, you know, have really limited the international banking opportunities in Cuba. You know, since we've started this process with Cuba in March, I've met counterparts in Cuba who have rep offices and so on, and they all say the same thing. They would love to open up an office. They would love to do business in Cuba as a full-fledged bank, but they can't because the parent is too afraid of the consequences. So regardless of when the currencies are combined, I still think you're going to have this issue of, you know, you almost have this third currency in terms of dollars, and then on top of that, the ability to use dollars internationally really handicaps the Cuban economy to a great degree.
So why did you step forward and offer to do banking for the embassy?
Well, you know, I've been going down there since 2011. It was an ethical issue for me and a couple of my board members who had been down there. It was an ethical issue. We felt like, you know, we had been told. I mean, it's as odd as it sounds, that, you know, the embassy was not going to be open until they found a bank, and they had been working without a bank for 15 months. So it really was just an ethical issue, and then kind of one thing led to the next, and we did the correspondent piece, and we just announced the debit card piece and everything. And So we're hoping other banks will eventually enter into the market as well. I mean, we're a $2.3 billion bank. It's ridiculous to think that we're the only U.S. bank that can do business with Cuba.
Have you had some pushback within Florida or not?
Very little, very little. I think there are some diehards, but I think most of the Cuban American population realizes after 50 years the futility of the embargo, and that hasn't really helped, and it's time to engage and chart a new path.
I mean, I'm sure other people here probably know this, but I don't. The remittances, which are now important from Florida especially to Cuba, it's people taking cash, or they can go to your bank and you can get those remittances to Cuba? No.
We're a commercial bank. We're not involved with the remittance programs. But, it's hard to tell how much money is really going down there. You have what we call the mules who take the cash down every flight.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going on. And then you have these kind of, then obviously you have the legitimate Western Union, and then you have the travel agencies that, you give them $50.
And Western Union is operating in Cuba?
Yes. They've got, I think, about 140 offices where people get remittances and that sort of thing from there.
Right.
So, but that's a big source of money for Cuba. I mean, you look at a lot of these paladors and things that have opened up. It's really money coming from the U.S.
Right.
that is really letting these small businesses start. It's very exciting in a way.
Right.
I mean, they need that capital to come in.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's take some questions. Do we have Slido? Yes, we do have Slido. Well, why don't we take them from the top? The real estate market in Cuba. That's really a question, I think, probably for another panel. But I mean, do any of you have anything to say on that in particular? But I think perhaps the next panel. And Dave, do you have any
Well, I mean,
insights on that?
prices in Havana have gone crazy. I mean, there's no question. I think they're up 30 or 40%. I'm not so sure the rest of Cuba is feeling the same appreciation, but in Havana, certainly it has increased. I'm not so sure. It's obviously creating some wealth for some people that live in Havana. It's probably making it a little less affordable for other people. So just same as in the U.S.
Ricardo, what does it feel like living in the middle of a real estate bubble?
Well, if I may say anything meaningful, I think we have to proceed carefully when it comes to the real estate market. So it's a very sensitive area, socially speaking, in Cuba. And I think already many Cubans are concerned about the spiral upwards in prices, not only in Havana, but in other, let's say, popular destinations in the country. And then there is a more fundamental issue around the real estate market, which is supply.
Yeah, sure.
We have a big problem with supply, so until we address that, there is no solution, there is no meaningful way forward for Cuba and for Cubans to have a decent apartment or house.
And I mean, Cubans can't just go and self-build on vacant land, right? As they would elsewhere, as people elsewhere in Latin America do, right?
Pardon me?
I mean, you can't go and do autoconstrucción.
You can. If you get a license, you can do it. Actually, now in Cuba we have like a let's say 3-tier system. So there is market of building supplies, sold at the market prices. So those who can afford that, they get the license from the government, which is now quite easy to get, and they can build their own house or something like that, or expand their own. Then there are the government is offering, banks are offering loans for those who want to expand, their houses or do some maintenance or even build a new one.
So including new construction, new homes, right?
Yeah, but it's small scale. So
Right.
it's not like,
Right, okay.
I mean, it's not keeping pace with demand, for sure.
Right. Marta, there's a question here. can you explain how the tax system works in Cuba? A small question. But how does it work from the point of view of the cuentapropistas? I mean, you always hear when you go and ask cuentapropistas how much tax do you pay, you get just a huge range of answers. I mean, what's the story?
Oh, it's very difficult to explain because it depends on the license you have. But you know, you have to. We could say two types of license for cuentapropistas, and one of them. You have to pay the 10% of your income monthly, no? And then at the end of the year,
that's gross income?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the year, you have a scale, but for example, that scale, if you earn more than 2,000 CUC a year, you have to pay like 50%.
50?
50%.
On income above 2,000?
Yes, profit, no? Profit income.
Income or profit, which?
I know,
It's
income, no?
Yeah, okay.
They're not firms, so no profit.
So that's designed to allow people to have an income which by Cuban standards is quite big, right? But not to get rich, right?
Yeah, it's the tax, you know, the taxes in Cuba is like, if it's for, you can live with what you're working for, you can live, but not to be rich, you can get rich with the taxes. Yes, but you know, you can hire staff, you can live with that, but.
Yes. I mean, at the beginning, these businesses were very, very small. I mean, there are now some of the restaurants, some of the bed and breakfasts are a bit bigger, but I mean, is it really in practice possible to set up what would be called a medium business, let's say, in Spain?
I didn't understand.
I mean, you said you can hire staff now, and you
Yeah.
can hire staff who are not family members now, right? I mean, but I mean, you still cannot build what in Spain would be una empresa mediana, digamos, no?
No, it's very difficult. Maybe if you are a cooperative, but no, a cooperative, everybody is socios, I know.
And the farmers, I mean, the private farmers?
They have problems with the supplies. It's true, it's difficult to have a medium. Now, if you go to a paladar, to a restaurant, you can see they're very big, you know, restaurant with a lot of stuff, with, but they have a lot of difficulties, and they have another way to have the business grow. I don't know how to explain grow the business. They have another ways to
you have to, as they say in Cuba,
have to be creative.
resolver, no? I mean, you
to
have
be
to
creative, yeah.
Yes.
Creative.
you have to kind of fix things as you go along, right?
Yeah.
Very good. Let's just see if there's some. Yeah, there's a question here.
Yes, Peter Kornblum from the National Security Archive. This is a question for Mr. Seleski. I was in Cuba 2 weeks ago and noted that the Cuban authorities are very focused on the issue that you raised about the continuing restrictions on the transfer of dollars through the banking system. And there was a very harsh editorial on Obama and his failure to address this in Granma while we were there, and then the leading Cuban negotiator with the United States, it was at the top of her list of complaints. And I'm wondering if you agree that, with the Cubans' position, that President Obama has the executive authority to change that situation, whether you've made that argument to the authorities in the U.S. government that this would be possible and is absolutely needed.
Well, I mean, we've obviously been pushing, you know, the bank has been pushing to, it's still difficult to get money back and forth. I mean, so we've been pushing for the dollar to be in use. I don't believe it's in Obama's authority to be able to do that, because I think it goes against Helmut's burden. But there's ways to mitigate it to some degree. But I'm not a lawyer. That's just my personal opinion. But it is probably the number one thing on the Cuban government's list right now is to get that restriction done. I mean, you know, it's been very onerous on them. You know, and it's not just transactions with the U.S. I mean, they send dollars to Germany, and all of a sudden the money gets seized. And I'm not being critical of OFAC. It's just that's part of it. But it is probably the highest priority. But I don't think I think it goes against the Helms-Burton Act entirely to just eliminate that restriction.
Other over here. Yeah.
Joe Perez, Los Angeles, California. Mr. Seleski, what is the procedure of your bank if I want to open an account for a debit card so that I can draw cash in Cuba rather than take cash with me when I go there?
Well, right now, there's some technology issues. Right now, you can only use the debit card for point of sale. So that you can go to the hotel or a restaurant or rental car and swipe it like a regular credit card. At some point early next year, we're anticipating that you'll actually be able to go to an ATM and be able to get cash. I mean, so there were some technology issues just in terms of things. You know, it's been challenging. All this stuff has been turned off for so long for the U.S. It's been kind of fun to work through some of these issues because the people that turned this stuff off aren't even around anymore. It's been so long when you think about it. But I mean, so it's been kind of fun. It's been a little challenging, but the full debit card use where you can actually get cash, that should be, I would think in the first half of next year that'll be done.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
My name is Michelle Wojcik. I own Galeria Cubana, so I've been working with many artists in Cuba for about 8 years. I have the artwork out there. So, but I'm curious about Marta's work. Are you in Havana? And I wanted to know, are you also linking, you're working with people, obviously entrepreneurs in Havana, but are you also the link between people in the United States that are doing this, potentially financing these micro enterprises?
Yeah. No, my business there, my license is for, you know, accounting services for business in Havana, and for advise them to open business in Cuba. You know, it is normal. I know how to, you know, for foreign investment, I know how to open a business in Cuba. I could help them, but my license is not for that. My company is to advise, to give financial services and accounting services for business and for private sector in Cuba. So, but if you have, if you need help or you need to know something, I can help you. But but no, it's not what I'm doing there. So.
Very good, Marta. Just, can I get you to address another question, which is, what is the potential for Cuban entrepreneurs to export to the United States? What are some examples of goods produced by Cuban private business that could be viable?
I think, I don't know if right now any entrepreneurs are exporting to the United States. I know.
I mean, you can't, can you?
No, they.
You can? You can?
Yes, I think somebody is trying to get the license with OFAC or something to export.
With OFAC, the Cuban government will allow you to do this.
Yeah.
Right.
And they are trying now, I think, to export with the cooperative.
Yeah.
Marabu.
Charcoal.
Yeah, and now one of my clients they're trying to export. She is a jewelry designer, and we're trying to export their things. We're working on that, but we're working. You know,
sure.
It's not. So we're trying to. I think I think the first thing they're going to export is the charcoal, no?
Yeah.
I hope so. It's a cooperative. but it's not. I think the Cuban government is. And you know, the first product they're going to export charcoal is not very beautiful for them. It's not very nice for them. But
Right, to
that's
start,
kind
isn't
of
it? But,
should be another thing. But yeah. Well, yeah, we're working on this. Yeah, that will be great because application. I have a lot of clients that could export the things.
yeah,
You will love them. Yeah.
very good. Dave, is Stonegate making payments to Cuban vendors on behalf of American businesses? How complicated is setting up vendor payments?
Ask me that question 4 weeks from now. We're working on some things to try to simplify that process a little bit right now. It is very difficult. There's still money is getting hung up, and you saw with the charter companies, you know, they had to cancel some flights. It was about a month ago. I think it was on the newspapers and things like that. We're working on a slightly more efficient way to try to get money back and forth. But you still have the same issue once again. You know, you're dealing in U.S. dollars. You know, that's a problem. You have the issue of, you know, a Cuban bank can't open a correspondent account in the U.S. It's not allowed, and even if they did, then it would be a Cuban government entity, and that would obviously be garnished. So, you know, you still have to work through intermediary banks to make payments going back and forth.
How much of this can be dealt with without lifting Helms-Burton?
I think ultimately Helms-Burton's got to be lifted. I think, you know, you're just putting Band-Aids on things, but I think there's a political process here, and I think as more American businesses get engaged with Cuba and they see the opportunity, I think there'll be more pressure on Congress to act on the embargo, and there's a lot more momentum than there ever was before. And I think, so it's positive that these small steps are being taken, but at the end of the day, you know, it sounds great, I'm going to go import this or I'm going to export that. You still got to deal with the embargo, and it's a huge, it's tying the Cuban government's hand behind their back in terms of their economy. It needs to go away.
Right. Ricardo, secured lending is very difficult, is very useful, but difficult in economies where ownership of property, etc., is uncertain. I mean, that's not true in Cuba now, is it? I mean, ownership of property is much clearer than it used to be, right? I mean, that's not a difficulty, right?
I would say that it's not perfect, but it has improved a lot over the last 5 years. So we are definitely now in a much better position to, I mean, those who own something, you know, like, you know, assets of all kinds and, you know, operate businesses, there are, you know, better conditions for them to, you know, secure their rights when it comes to what they own, what they do. Yeah.
And if we look at this from the Cuban end, I mean, we've talked about currency reform, we've talked about the exchange rates. I mean, the issue that people say or always tell me about and have done for several years that they want to see change. I mean, the farmers want to have the ability to freely, they can now sell much more freely, but it's the buying of inputs which is a problem for them. And this issue of the state monopoly of foreign trade and of wholesale markets. I mean, do you see a reasonable prospect of that getting onto the agenda after the Congress or not?
I mean, I hope so. I mean, what we're seeing now is increasingly, you know, like an emerging contradiction in the sense that, so we now have like a growing private sector, a growing non-state sector. But for that sector to have a meaningful impact and to play a major role in the economy, you need to complement that with other things. You know, it's not only your ability to open a business, it's about running a business successfully. You know, having a banking system that supports you, you know, your ability to, you know, to have a, you know, a supply chain like in place, like to access to international markets, whether for imports or to export. So I think it should be part of the agenda, because otherwise, like we are creating like a, you know, a two-tier system. So we have the state-owned enterprises operating, you know, one level, and then you have all of those, you know, cooperatives and the private sector doing something else, and it doesn't make sense. So For me, it's you know, the next steps are a lot about leveling the playing field for everyone. So a dollar or a CUC or whatever invested in a state company is not better than one invested in the private sector. So if we want to really make a jump in terms of productivity and efficiency, you know, economy-wide, you really have to level the playing field for all actors.
I think with Mariel,
The special economic zone in Mariel.
the enterprises who, the companies who will be there, they can sell directly to the cooperatives and la importadora, the importer,
The trading company.
the trading company disappear in Mariel, so the companies there can sell directly to cooperatives.
And these trading companies will be private, foreign, private, national, state, or
the
what?
trade companies are all state companies, but the
So state companies, yeah.
yes, they're state companies.
But they'll operate under
But
different
yes, but if you
rules.
have a company outside Mariel, you have to sell through a trading company. But if you are in Mariel, if you have your company in Mariel, you can sell directly to your final consumer, you know, to the cooperative directly. The trading company disappear in Mariel.
Right, interesting.
So it will be easy for the
So
for
then,
cooperative to buy products who sell in Mariel. So.
let me just be clear. I mean, if there's a Brazilian glass manufacturer in Mariel
Yeah.
Making bottles, that company can sell directly to a cooperative.
Yeah.
That's new.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ricardo, just finally, a difficult question. My all the other ones have been easy. My sense is that over the last couple of years, the slowing of the pace of reform, not of change, but of reform, of economic reform, and I think there has been a slowing of economic reform in the last 2 years, is not just because of the technical complexity of the issues that the government now faces, but also greater political resistance as the reform process has moved forward. I don't know if you share that perception, and if you do, whether what might change the political dynamics.
Well, I think that you know, what's happened is that so far we've taken advantage of the low-hanging fruits in this reform process. You know, things that were obvious, that there was a broad consensus on how to proceed at the very beginning, so we went for them. Now it's a different stage.
Mm-hmm.
So now there is a clear need to do follow-up to those initial changes. You know, I just talked about, you know, giving coherence to, you know, ownership structure and how resources are allocated throughout the economy. So that's a lot more complex. There are, you know, issues out there as to where, for instance, you know, what's the role, or what will be the role for the private sector or for the non-state sector in Cuba's economy. So it's now approaching 30% of Cuba's labor force. So do we want it to get to 50%, 60%? So I think those are tough questions, and we know that, you know, there is there is resistance, and there are concerns about, you know, what that might imply in terms of political power or something like that. So my opinion is that so we're in this moment right now. So it doesn't make any sense to, you know, stop doing stuff, you know, out of, you know, some concerns. So for me, it's more about like how can we come up with a sort of coherent and sort of strategic plan to give continuity to what we've done so far. And you know, in very difficult circumstances, we've seen what the private sector has done in Cuba during the last 5 years. So, and I would say that has a positive impact on people's living standards. So more services, even goods, being available for Cubans. more jobs being created, some of them well-paid jobs. So, and that's what people want. So people want, improving living standards. People want to have more options, and I think it's really up to us to provide them with, the conditions for that to be possible in Cuba over the coming years. Especially, I would say, for newer generations.
Mm.
So the stakes are higher for those generations. So, for me, so it's, I'm very proud of, having in Cuba free education and healthcare, but that's not something that my generation accomplished. When I was born, that was already there. So now it's time for other things.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I think this panel's been marvelous. It's been really insightful and really interesting. And I've learned a lot, and I'm sure all of you have, and from each of our panelists. So thank you all very much indeed.
You're welcome.